This is Dr. Larson, and I'm bringing you a lecture on implementation frameworks for HCW 661. Now, an implementation framework is a theory or a framework that is used that helps explain why we think the intervention will have an effect on the public health of the people. And so we might think up an intervention, but it's based on some type of belief. The people designing the intervention think that given the situation that what is done will improve health. And there are various different theories and frameworks that we're going to discuss. There are exactly 9 of them in today's lecture. We're going to go through some of the older ones early and then some of the newer ones later to this ninth one that's disruptive cues, and I'll talk a little bit about an intervention we're doing in southern province Zambia around hand washing using disruptive cues. So first framework or theory on the agenda is the health belief model. And the health belief model it theorizes that health-related behavior is a product of belief and perceptions. So you believe your actions will do something, and then you do those actions. You perceive that your actions will improve or decrease your health, and then you change those actions. And it's related to this idea of perceived susceptibility, perceived severity, perceived benefits, and perceived barriers. That we see, that we experience all of these things that influence us to make decisions that improves our health or not. 2 terms in the health belief model that are important. The first is a cue to action, the idea that something elicits a response in us, or some cue gives us an idea that we should change behavior or do a certain behavior. And then self-efficacy is the idea that our behavior can influence our health, or what we do matters is self-efficacy. There are lots of limitations to the health belief model. Some of those limitations around the idea of cues, that they are widespread or that they are distributed equally across the populations. And when we talk about limitations to these theories and models, we're talking about limitations in the application of these theories or models for public health interventions. And so when we say that not we have unequal access to information about health, that means that would limit our ability to influence population health based on this model if we're assuming that all people have that the cues to action are widespread and they all have good access to health information. The model does not account for addictive behaviors, doesn't account for behaviors that have non-health motivations. And so it has a hard time explaining how smoking, which may be driven by either a decision, perhaps driven by a need to fit in or to be cool, that's a non-health related reason driving that health behavior. And this health belief model kind of doesn't work to explain that. Another theory that's used in public health is social cognitive theory, and this was pioneered by Bandura in the Bobo the Clown studies. And if you're familiar with Bobo the Clown, the studies around that, they had a couple different classrooms of preschoolers and this clown doll that you hit it and it comes back up. And they had an adult come in each of the classrooms. In one classroom, they interacted with the clown doll in a positive manner. In the other classroom, they interacted with the clown doll in an angry manner, hitting it, kicking it, and being aggressive toward it both physically and verbally. Now, what they saw is that the children modeled the same behavior. They repeated the behavior that they saw from the adults. And so this idea of social cognitive theory is that our behavior occurs within a context, within an environment, that it can be learned from others, and that our health-related behaviors are on display all throughout society, and we pick them up from others as we go through life. This social cognitive theory in action is exemplified by the Twende na Wakati intervention in Tanzania, and this was a radio program or a radio soap opera that modeled positive interactions and positive discussions about family planning and contraception. And so you have in Tanzania, you have a pretty good underlying ownership of radios, and a lot of those and even people that don't own radios listen to the radio, and they listen to these soap operas. And so what they had is the idea that your protagonist models the social norms that you're trying to influence. And so the good guy or the good girl in these soap operas are using contraception, or they're talking to their spouse about family planning. And then the bad guy models bad values. The villain models these poor values such as dishonesty or promiscuity, um, and you try to change social norms that way. And you see from this graph that there was a great difference between non-listeners and listeners. And so it appears to be have been effective in this Twende Nawakati uh, intervention. And it works well. The social conduct theory, I think it works well. I definitely believe I've, that we learn from others, and that's the idea: is that you pick up norms from others, and you can influence those norms for the better through purposeful public health action. And sometimes it's not even public health related. You know, these soap operas aren't about health; they just include information about. They just include attributes that are good to model. And a non-health parallel would be like product placement. You know, the majority of, or not the majority, but many companies will pay money to have their products placed in movies. And so when somebody opens up a computer, it shows it's an Apple computer, for example. Or when somebody has a drink of a soft drink, it shows it's a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi, whichever. Next, we'll talk about the theory of reasoned action or planned behavior. And so the idea that we have these underlying beliefs about our behaviors and norms and controls, and then we have these attitudes and perceptions about that. Those lead to intentions, and then it leads to behavior. So that our beliefs lead to our attitudes or norms, and those lead to our intentions and our behavior. And you can see how this would be nice. You just change the beliefs, change the norms, and then you get a behavior change. Attitudes, in this case, the attitudes, they're the personal opinion of the behavior. The intention is a motivation to perform the behavior. And you can read this as well as I can, so I won't just repeat it. The theory of planned behavior has a number of limitations. And the biggest one is that, and I think it's we all see it, is that we don't act on what we know. We're human, we know that running every day or aerobic exercise every day decreases or improves our health, but a lot of Americans don't exercise, including me. I don't exercise all that often. And so there's issues with saying that the behavior is planned. There's a lot of things that this theory does not account for, including environmental factors, past experiences, other barriers such as fear, but the biggest one is that it assumes that the behavior is a result of a decision-making process, and typically though, and that's up for debate. And in some of the theories that I like better, I think this one, the theory that I like, we'll talk about that last, the nudge theory and disrupt. Those are my favorite, and they are very much in opposition to this theory of planned behavior. Next is this diffusion of innovation. And the diffusion of innovation is a type of social contagion. And social contagion has been described over the last maybe like 50 years ago for the first time as the process of attitudes and beliefs and how they spread through a population. and it can be easily visualized with fashion and men's hairstyles. If you watch European football, or soccer, as Americans call it, you'll see the hairstyles of next year in New York. And so the footballers will have these kind of wild hairstyles, and then the next year you'll start to see that same hairstyle pick up steam here in New York and across the United States. And the fashion diffuses from these trendsetters and goes throughout the population. Now the same thing happens with innovation theory. We're with innovation. That when you have a new innovation such as a smartphone, you get these early people that get it, and they start talking about it in a good light. Say, this is awesome, it makes me more productive, I can watch videos, I can text, I can do whatever, take pictures. And they start influencing others who are early adopters, and then the majority has it, and then you have fewer people having it, and then you have this group that are the laggards. They kind of never embrace the smartphone. I'm one of those. I actually want to get rid of my smartphone, but that's a conversation for another day. And so you diffuse this technology or this innovation through a population. Now, this theory can be applied for public health. And one example, oh wait, not before we get to the example, is the when people adopt any new behavior or technology or health belief, then they go through these stages where they are examining the knowledge, whether it's better, they become persuaded, they make a decision on things, and there's a lot of things go into this, such as the relative advantage, the compatibility, the complexity. So one example is I invited you to use Mendeley for this class and my other class. And some students will use that and will use that for everything, and others will not use it for anything. And they're looking at it through this lens of, well, is it better than what I used before to manage references? How hard is it for me to manage it, to use this software? Does it work with what I use? And does it work with like Microsoft Word, Internet Explorer? And then am I trying it out before I have to embrace it? So now applying this to public health, a really good study came out of Tulane actually. What the dean of my school where I went talked about doing this study where they tried to change the practice of routine episiotomies in Argentina and Uruguay. And an episiotomy is performed during labor when when the doctor cuts the pregnant woman's vagina to prevent tearing during birth. And so a clean cut is much easier to heal than a tear. So a routine episiotomy is where you do it no matter what. Now, there's no science that suggests that is good. And so the majority of times, these women are being cut for no reason, or there's no medical benefit to them being cut. And I think as the women here will know, that's not fun, and as the guys can imagine, that's not something that they would like to have happen to if they were a woman. And so it's an issue they tried to change. And so they enrolled these opinion leaders, these perceived leaders or trendsetters in the hospitals, these popular doctors or the influential ones, and they brought them to a 5-day workshop. Now, it's difficult to bring everybody to the workshop because the hospital still needs to run and it's expensive. So they just brought a few team leaders or the few opinion leaders, and they went over the evidence. They convinced these opinion leaders that routine episiotomies have to stop. And then they invited the opinion leaders to hold workshops and train, and they disseminate through that. What they found, you can see in these next results, is that the intervention, the routine episiotomy, decreased by almost half. And so it was very good. And then the controls, it didn't change. Worked really well. And here's some more results here. As you can see from, well, I'll kind of highlight. So you see here in the median baseline rate is that the oxytocin prophylactic was not very well used. The episiotomy was used quite a lot, especially in first pregnancies. And then the oxytocin went way, way up. Episiotomies went way, way down and moved forward. In the control hospitals, there was a small change in oxytocin use, but not the same immediate change, or not immediate, but dramatic change. There is no change basically in the episiotomies, no change among primiparis or women having their first child, and no change really among multiparis or women having multiple births, and even a slight increase right there. And if you look at some of these other issues, is that the postpartum hemorrhage also decreased. The blood loss also decreased. And that's the intervention hospitals compared to control hospitals. The tears did not increase, and so they didn't have any issues with the tears. And I said vagina, and I guess it's the perineum, and I apologize for my lack of anatomy skills. And then there's no difference in stillbirths and neonatal deaths. Were not much different either. And so it was an effective intervention just by taking these opinion leaders and letting them diffuse the information. The norms and the behaviors changed among the targeted population of doctors, and the people benefited as a result. There are some limitations to the diffusion of innovation when applied as a public health theory. It's hard to stop behaviors, and so if you have, and you can imagine this, if you have a bunch of high school students that are smoking, and the cool new kid is not a smoker, it would be challenging for those students to then stop smoking so that they could be like the cool new kid. That example breaks down if you look at it too far, but the idea that stopping behavior is more challenging in this diffusion of innovation. And then the other one is that environmental and economic factors can play a role in behavior and in health, and the diffusion of innovation doesn't change those. And so it is dependent upon the environment, or it's acting in the environment already and doesn't change. All right. Oh, excuse me. I have the hiccups there. 1 second. Okay. Next, we'll look at the stages of change, or the trans-theoretical model. And you may have seen this, especially if you're in addiction studies. This is commonly used to explain changes in addictive behavior. This idea that you have these different phases that people are in. The pre-contemplation phase, where you're thinking about changing, or you're kind of thinking about changing, and then you start thinking about it, you move into the contemplation stage, and then you start making a decision, all right, I'm going to change. You take the actions and you actually change, and then you relapse. And then you kind of move back around in the cycle and do the maintenance and whatnot. There's a lot that goes into this trans-theoretical model, and it's very useful for individuals on an individual basis. There are questions about how useful it is on a population level. And some of the limitations that have been raised is that behavior always happens within the social context. And if you never change that social context, how can you expect people to change just by thinking about it, making the decision, understanding relapse as part of the process? It's hard to define when people are moving between stages, and then even though it's logical, is it really the way things work, this movement through? All right. Next one we'll talk about is the social norms theory. And this is a pretty cool, I really like this one. This is a pretty cool theory that's been applied to public health. And it is underlying the idea that the actual norm is not the same as the perceived norm. And so say I'm a person that has a perception of, and we can, let's see, maybe we can talk about politics hopefully. So there's a perception of a Trump supporter as a redneck racist. That's out there. When in reality, the typical Trump supporter might be different from that. And so there's a perceived norm and an actual norm. And I don't know what the typical Trump supporter is. This is just an example I think that's timely. And my apologies if it's too soon for some. Um, Another example would be the perceived norm around different ethnicities. And so, um, like my wife's from Brazil, and she constantly ran into this issue that she would be, just because when people found out, especially guys, when they found out she was from Brazil, she was perceived differently than she actually is, um, and it really bothered her, with good reason. And so the when you use the social norms theory and apply it to a public health setting, you really have to understand the perception. You have to understand, what do people think, and then they try to influence that perception by showing information on what is actually true. There's two good examples that I've found. The first is the True Beauty campaign. And so this is from Dove, the True Beauty campaign, and it's based on the the idea that they found in their research only 4% of women around the world consider themselves beautiful, which is awful. Very low. And then 11% of girls use the term beautiful to describe their looks. And so these young women and women in general don't consider themselves beautiful. But the social pressure is there. And so the perceived norm here is that beautiful is twig skinny. And the Dove campaign is showing real women, live women, unairbrushed women. The True Beauty campaign, unairbrushed, no artificialness here, and showing that these are real women and they are beautiful. And then some young lady or a woman might identify with these women, their body type, and say, hey, if this one's beautiful, maybe I'm beautiful. And you can see that there's all sorts of skin colors. The body size is natural, and it's trying to take back from Hollywood this perception of what beauty is. And so that's an application of a social norms theory. Another good example is brought to us by the University of Arizona. And so they found that the perceived norm was that college students are drinkers, and binge drinkers at that. And so they created a campaign where they informed the student body on the actual norm. And so these students then see, oh, hey, look, most University of Arizona students are studying a lot. They're talking to their faculty. They're going to office hours. They're working, and they're not drinking all that much. And so when people are approached by the opportunity to drink to binge drink, then they say, oh, that's not the norm. That's something different. They can choose to participate if they want, but it's no longer the perceived norm. And this campaign actually cut heavy drinking dramatically in the 1990s. So that's the social norms theory. It does have limitations, as they all do. Um, People that already have a perception of reality, a perception of norms, may question the messaging or the facts. I think so. They might say, "Well, that's not true." So they might look at this University of Arizona's poster and say, "Oh, really? 61% really work 11 hours or more per week?" Yeah, right. And they just disregard the message, and that would then be a problem. The people trying to craft the message may misunderstand the misperceptions. Um, and and forward. So next is another really cool framework called the positive deviance, or the outliers. And the positive deviance was developed in the 70s, and you have this nice picture of some muddy crabs. And these researchers, these public health practitioners, they're working in Vietnam, and they went to a village with high rates of malnutrition, high rates of child stunting or failure to grow, which is a result of chronic malnutrition. And these villages had more than 75%. And they held village meetings with the villagers, and they found that nobody had any efficacy. They thought that nobody could, they were just too poor. They needed help, and they were just too poor. Well, the public health people went also to the other 25% whose kids were thriving. And they said, what are you doing different? And these families, they lived in the same village. They had the same access to resources, very similar families, but their kids were healthy. And so the public health practitioners asked, well, what are you doing differently? And they found that the major crop was rice in the area, and that was the staple food. And the families with healthy children were taking the shrimp and the crabs from the rice paddies and including them when they cooked up the rice. And these are really small shrimps and crabs. We're talking the size of a fingernail. They're not the crabs that you'd break open and eat the meat. These are just very small crabs that you'd just throw in the pot. And this provided the micronutrients to the children, the protein, the calcium, the vitamin A, the vitamin C, vitamin D, iron. All these micronutrients from the crabs came into the rice. The rice provides the calories, and these kids thrived. Now, it was a bit taboo to eat these. These little crabs, little muddy crabs and shrimp, they're not they're kind of like bugs, they're kind of crawly critters, and it was taboo to do this. But the families that had thriving kids were doing well, and so the the public health practitioners took these families with thriving children and brought them forward and said, this is what they're doing, and we think that if you do it too, your kids will thrive. And rather focusing on the risk factors for the underweight kids, they're poor and that they don't have access to food, they looked at people in the same situation and looked at, well, what are they doing differently? What are the positives? Another way to think about positive deviance is natural selection or evolution, is that the positive traits are passed on to the next generation. A few principles of when using positive deviance with public health. The first one is that the solution is held within the community. They know there is somebody in the community that's doing well in terms of health, and what are they doing that's different from the rest. The second is that experts may be blinded to the solution because of past training, where experts may have a tendency to arrive in a community and say, "Oh, I know what this community needs," and find the intervention from outside. But the intervention needs to come from the community. And this has been applied in numerous circumstances. I talked about the story of the child malnutrition in Vietnam, but it's also female circumcision in Egypt. And you can think about, well, how can we change female circumcision? Let's go to these where there's high social pressures for women to be circumcised at young ages or before marriage. But what about the women that aren't? Not every single one is, and so what are they doing different? Infant mortality in Pakistan, in Uganda, in Maine. There's one in, I think it was in Peru, where they found that the mothers in Peru, the communities they were looking at, the staple food was soup, and so every dinner was soup, and they found that the mothers with the healthiest children scoop the bottom of the soup for their kids, and the bottom is like where the meats would settle and the vegetables, and so the kids got more of the chunkiness instead of the broth, and so changing the way they scooped would improve things. um, and here's a nice cartoon that shows the positive deviant, somebody who thinks outside the box, or this outlier. The When applied to public health, this has a huge emphasis on the community. What is the community? The solutions within that community. So what are they going to do? And it you can think of social diffusion theory as well. As you start to change these behaviors, what's happening in terms of improving things with the community. Coming from the community, it diffuses more easily. Another example of positive deviants or outliers in the negative where the solution did not come from the community or when it didn't work was with Ignaz Semmelweis. And he discovered, before germ theory, he discovered that washing hands after autopsies or after dealing with patients improved health outcomes at hospitals. And it's pretty morbid, his story. I don't know if you've heard it or not, or if you've heard it before or not, but he worked at a hospital where he worked in with cadavers in the med school, and then also delivered babies. And he had an atrocious maternal mortality rate, where women just they would rather deliver in the street than go to this man's hospital. And he noticed that the midwives that were just nearby had a fantastic maternal mortality rate, and he had the self awareness to say, is it something that we are doing? Is it something I am doing? And he came up with a theory that he was transporting death particles from the dead bodies the to the uh, to the women giving birth, and the death particles were infecting the women and killing them. And so he started washing hands with chlorinated lime solution, and really cut maternal mortality in his hospital down quite a lot. Well, this was fantastic, and he took this to the ends of the earth, or tried to. And he became this very adamant hand washing person, but he was ridiculed throughout the scientific community, and he actually ended up in an insane asylum because of it. Um, but he was a visionary. It just wasn't done in the right way, and perhaps it couldn't have been. But that's another example of finding the solution within the community that he saw. So he saw where things were working well, and wondered if, and it helped drive what he was thinking. All right, next go into some more modern theories, and there's a book called Nudge that outlines the argument for libertarian paternalism. And these ideas come from the field of behavioral economics. And behavioral economics um, is similar to health behaviors, but typically looks at the way people spend money or save for the future. And it's a bit farther ahead than the health belief theories, and only now is public health starting to reach out to some of these theories in behavioral economics that it's easier to study in some ways how people save money um, or not, and then how people do health behaviors. It's just easier science to do. And so they're a bit further ahead than the public health thinking, and we're starting to adopt some of these, which is good. So this argument is that Homo economicus, or the person in the health belief model, or the transactional model, or any of these models that say that perception, or once you know something, you start doing it. They are based on this idea of a Homo economicus, or a person that thinks rationally, makes informed decisions carefully, and understands the costs and benefits of each action. And this person is completely rational. In reality, we are Homo sapiens, completely irrational, boneheaded, and oftentimes have no clue about what's going on. And so I have this picture of a great caricature of Homo sapiens, Homer Simpson, where he's a doofus, and we are like him. And so in the nudge school of thought, there's different heuristics that we use to make decisions. And so we use an idea called anchoring. When we come across a new environment or have to make a choice, we try to anchor that choice with something that's familiar. And an example of this is the price of right. And they have a microwave, and they say, what's the price of this microwave? And you think, well, I just bought a stove, and that cost me this, so I'm going to say $200, right? And I have no clue if $200 will even get you I bet you can get a cheaper microwave than that. But yeah. Then you also look at use stereotypes. How do we make snap decisions? Stereotypes. We're overly optimistic, and so do you consider yourself better than average as a driver? And then you look at gains and losses. So we place a greater emphasis or a greater value on loss than on gains. So if you're going to lose money, then you're very hesitant. If you're going to lose something, if something's going to be taken away from you, you're very hesitant about that. As opposed to if you're going to gain something, it's nice, but you definitely don't want to lose something. Um, there's a status quo bias that the default is supreme. We'll look at that in a minute. And then these influence the way that we frame decisions in public health. And so, are we losing money when we take that money out of our paycheck, or are we just saving it for later? Um, all right. So this graph shows the percent of individuals who are organ donors across numerous European countries. In blue, you have those countries with a policy of opt-out. And on the y-axis here, the y-axis goes from 0 to 100%. Across the x-axis, you have different countries: Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. The blue is an opt-out country, where they are automatically enrolled in an organ donor scheme when they get their driver's license, and they have the choice to opt out. And then the pink or red is the opt-in country, where they are not automatically enrolled in an organ donor scheme, but they have the chance to opt in. This is called changing the default. And the default is what's going to happen if the person does nothing. In blue, what's going to happen is they're going to be organ donors. In red, they're not going to be organ donors unless they do something. And you see the very stark differences between the different types of countries. And so that's one of the principles of nudge, is change that default to make the default healthier. And you get to and now we're starting to see a little bit more of this idea of libertarian paternalism. The paternalism being that the public health people or the state knows what's best for the people, and then the libertarian part being that even though we know what's best, we're going to let anybody choose. We just choose the default to be the best option, and then people can opt out if they want. Other principles includes incentives and understanding what is making people, what's drawing them to change that behavior. The feedback loop, help them understand what their choices are doing, to structure complex choices more easily, to allow for easy comparison. That's like looking at miles per gallon. That's an example of that. It should actually be gallons per mile. Yeah. And that's Nudge. And the book Nudge is pretty cool. It's pretty good. All right, last one we're going to talk about are disruptive cues. And disruptive cues come from, or based upon the science of neurology and behavior, whereas our neural pathways are strengthened when they're used. And so if our neural pathways controlling a certain behavior are used repeatedly, that's strengthened and we get entrenched in those habits. And our human behavior is based upon habits. And many of the decisions we make we're on autopilot, basically. We've made this decision 100 times. Another way to think about this is that the past behavior is the best predictor of the future behavior. And for any individual, that's true. It's not exactly predictive, but it's the best predictor that we have. And the disruptive cues, they aim to shock this system, throw it into madness, excuse me, and change the behavior for the better. Excuse me. So one example of this is by using disruptive cues in schools for hand washing. And so here on the top you have these two schools, their latrines, and here on the bottom are the same schools and their latrines. And so you see this little footpath from the latrines, and then it's nice step, 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 and then disruptive cue, triangle, wash your hands, right? Same thing here, before and after. Nice footpath, step, step, step. Oh wait, I'm getting led over here. Triangle, oh, I should wash my hands. And this was done in Bangladesh by some folks from the Sunni Buffalo, just next door. and or a little further next door. What they found is that when you have the hand washing infrastructure, then you improve a little bit on hand washing from your baseline. That's good. But then you add that nudge with the footpath and the disruptive cues, and this disruptive cues is one of the does come from the nudge school of thought. Then you have these cues, you improve hand washing behavior quite dramatically. Look at that jump, really good, and that is it. Um, we're using this same disruptive behavior in Zambia to try to influence hand washing again, similar to Bing.